This is Outrageous History.
Hello and welcome to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson. The origins of the Cold War in the late 1940s and early 1950s are far grimmer than the cloak and dagger films and television shows that it inspired during the 1960s and 1970s. The realization in 1949 that the Soviet Union had successfully tested its own nuclear weapon and had 4.5 million troops amassed along Eastern Europe triggered extreme anxiety amongst U.S. military leaders. This fear was so great that General Curtis E. LeMay, who headed the Strategic Air Command, urged the U.S. government that a preemptive atomic strike on the now turned enemy Soviet Union would be the only way to save lives in a military conflict. Into this scenario in 1951 flew a U.S. Air Force Globemaster cargo plane, number 49244, loaded with a crew of top-level atomic warfare specialists and a mysterious cargo, headed for a military base in the UK. The aircraft never made it to base. It disappeared somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean west of Ireland. Neither the plane nor survivors were ever found. Pulitzer-prize winning journalist Tod Robberson has tried to answer the critical questions arising from this ill-fated flight and its wider implications that are pertinent to our contemporary times. Those answers are compiled in his book, Globemaster Down: Soviet Espionage and the Doomed American Attempt to Sneak Nukes into Europe. Tod joins us today to discuss those questions and possible answers. Tod, thanks for being here with us today.
Ernest, thank you very much for having me.
You know, when you consider the time period when Globemaster 49244 disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean, only a few years after the victory of the Second World War, you would think that there would be a period of relief for the world's population, a time of optimism and hope. But in fact, for those in power, it was a tense and threatening time. You know, I think of the Cuban blockade in 1962 as one of the most dangerous times in world history. But the circumstances of the early 1950s seem to be easily just as dangerous. Explain for us the global situation during those years following the Second World War and into the early 1950s.
Well, exactly. I mean, in fact, that very situation is the title of my first chapter, which is Heady Days. You know, Americans were full of optimism. They were militarily unchallenged in the world. They had nuclear supremacy at the time. They were the only nuclear superpower, and that probably led to a little bit of hubris. Americans didn't know at the time that the Soviets had completely infiltrated the Manhattan Project. They didn't know that there were, in fact, spies in our midst, vacuuming up all kinds of information to hand to Joseph Stalin. And as you noted, there were 4.5 million Soviet troops still under arms. They were not demobilizing, even though the Allies were very busy demobilizing and bringing troops home and trying to reintegrate them into civilian society. So it was against that backdrop that American military commanders and the National Security Council started looking very closely at the imbalance in Europe and what might be going on there in terms of Soviet preparations for a possible move into some European countries, if not all of them. And that was the setting for the Globemaster flight.
Well, so tell us about the significance of the Strategic Air Command at the time, because that seems to be this major connection to what was happening in Europe.
At the time, the Strategic Air Command was the nation's sole nuclear force. Even though the law limited Curtis LeMay's ability to actually get his hand on a nuclear weapon and deploy it. If it ever came to the point where the president ordered a nuclear strike, the only military unit capable of delivering that was the Strategic Air Command. So Curtis LeMay was the tip of the spear, if you will. If it ever came to the point where the president determined the Soviets needed to be stopped, he would have been the one to execute that order.
Let's talk a little bit about Curtis LeMay. You state in your chapter, A General's General, that he may well go down in history as the most brutal mass murdering general ever to command an American fighting force. But as you explained, there was so much more to the man than this reputation.
As I write in the book, he had a reputation for being stern, a taskmaster. All of the photos of Curtis LeMay are of an unsmiling man in a crisp uniform, a little bit dumpy in appearance, never smiling, and usually with a cigar out of the side of his mouth. And it gave the impression of a humorless, his troops called him a hard ass, just a tough guy. And I think he was a little bit misunderstood. He was a caring father, a loving husband. He cared immensely about his troops and not sending them into any wartime situation that he himself would not be prepared to lead the way. And in terms of his stern look, he had something called Bell's palsy, which caused the side of his face to droop. And doctors had recommended that he chomp on a cigar as a way of exercising the muscles in his face to keep that drooping from going further. And so it just gave him this look. Now, he was a very smart man, and he had some examples such as Douglas MacArthur and Patton to kind of lead the way on how not to be a general in such an elevated position. You know, he learned from their mistakes. He learned to keep his mouth shut and publicly to follow orders. He never made a public pronouncement calling for nuclear war against the Soviets or anything like that. Privately, he was a strong advocate of a preemptive strike on the Soviets, and I was able to uncover a lot of documents that demonstrated how strongly he felt about that.
Now we're slowly making our way to the actual flight of the Globemaster, but in trying to set that up, we know that General LeMay plays probably the most prominent role in this post-World War II epic. But then you also take us through what seems to be this very outrageous drama of another important Air Force member, and that's Paul T. Cullen. Tell us about his role.
Paul Cullen he started out his career as an Army Air Forces pilot in the, I guess, early 1930s, and quickly got a reputation for his extraordinary abilities to conduct aerial photo reconnaissance. And that ability caught the attention of a lot of higher-ups in the Army Air Forces at the time. He got deployed over to North Africa to conduct aerial reconnaissances. German forces were massing and solidifying their positions in North Africa. He had a bit of a break in his career, a high-profile break, in that the person who served as his navigator on those flights over North Africa was Elliot Roosevelt, the president's son. And because of that, he got a lot of exposure. Some of it he hadn't planned for, but he certainly milked it for all he could. The guy was in headlines across the country, if not across the world. and certainly reporters were following every move of Elliott Roosevelt himself. So the two were kind of a dynamic duo. They were swashbuckling across North Africa. Occasionally, they were spotted by reporters, including C.L. Sulzberger of the New York Times, who wrote a number of articles that didn't quite cite their sources, but it's pretty apparent that that one of those two was his source, because everything he listed as American aerial reconnaissance activity in North Africa was exactly where Elliott Roosevelt and Paul Cullen were flying. After World War II, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but Paul Cullen had exposure all the way up to the president himself. He dined with Elliott at the White House, and you know, he was in charge of keeping the president's son safe, and that was an awesome task. No one else had that responsibility other than Paul Cullen. After the war was Operation Crossroads, and that was almost exactly a year after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Paul Cullen was assigned the duty of amassing a very large contingent of aerial photographers and planes equipped with very heavy photographic equipment to photograph the first atomic bomb test over the Marshall Islands in the Bikini Atoll, and it was during that mission that Paul Cullen encountered a Red Cross worker named Reva Joy Hurwitz, and they struck up a relationship, struck up a love affair, and the little scandal in this is that Paul Cullen was married at the time. He was 16 years into his marriage at that point. And there were a number of other military officers who noted what was going on and tried to talk to him about it. But after Operation Crossroads, the two of them returned to the United States and continued their love affair. They wound up going to Mexico and getting married, and I was able to recover their marriage certificate in Spanish in Mexico. He had not yet bothered to divorce his first wife, so this officially made him a bigamist. It put him in direct violation of military as well as civil law in the United States. So that was a huge problem for Paul Cullen legally. For the military, it was a huge problem in terms of security. It made him highly vulnerable to blackmail. And that's why I spend so much time in the book focusing on how Paul Cullen and Reva Hurwitz fell in love, what happened to their relationship after that, and how long it took Paul Cullen after that to finally file for divorce from his first wife, but never quite complete the process, at least in legal terms. So that when he died, he left behind two women claiming the right to his death benefits, among other things. And so that's it. It was a security issue, and I make very clear in this that that doesn't mean that Paul Cullen was blackmailed by the Soviets, but it means that he was a potential source of information for the Soviets as well as his two wives, because he was talking about his upcoming mission to the United Kingdom with both wives, and they testified to this later in court. And when you have the expansion of the circle of secrecy beyond just the military realm on a top secret mission like this, you open up a number of vulnerabilities for spies to find out what was going on. All it took was the right spy being in the right place at a bridge meeting, a garden club meeting, whatever those women were attending, where they might have been talking about their upcoming move to Britain and why they were moving to Britain. Then all of a sudden you've got information that is of high value to the Soviets, and that's why I introduced that into the book.
Right. So the personalities of these pilots and anybody associated with that kind of program played a huge part. So you know that in your chapter entitled Fatman, it describes the giant egos of those commanding officers for, first of all, the two atomic bomb missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So what was the relationship between those missions and the Globemaster mission 6 years later?
Well, it's complex. You know, first of all, there was the issue of the pilots involved, particularly in the Nagasaki mission. The commander of the Hiroshima bombing, the first deployment of an atomic bomb in war, was Paul Tibbets. And Paul Tibbets chose as his operations officer for the 509th bombardment group, Lieutenant Colonel James I. Hopkins. And James Hopkins was a pilot who also had experience over North Africa, attacking Rommel's troops during World War II. And he trained at Wendover with all of the other pilots who later were part of the force that would attack Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Tibbets chose as the pilot for the Nagasaki mission Chuck Sweeney, who was a major at the time. And Chuck Sweeney had some kind of a problem with Colonel Hopkins, and they kind of battled it out. There's substantial evidence in some of the accounts of the other pilots who were present at the base where they were training, the various bases where they were training, that the two just didn't get along together. So there was that rivalry, and it turned out that both of them were flying planes. You know, Sweeney was flying the plane that actually dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. Hopkins was flying the plane that would take the photos of the explosion. And these were two very crucial parts of the mission. The Americans needed to know exactly what was the yield of the bomb, the accuracy, and so forth. And so Hopkins's plane was crucial to that mission. The two planes and a third plane got separated before the mission, and that became a huge problem of whether they should have proceeded with the bombing without Hopkins's photographic plane following them, or whether they should wait. And that led to an argument aboard Sweeney's plane, where a more senior naval officer ordered him to proceed and abide by the orders they had received to not let anything delay that flight. And Sweeney wanted to wait around for Hopkins's plane in hopes that they could catch up. In fact, they were just flying over each other. They were separated by clouds and they couldn't see each other. They were actually very close. But anyway, as they are delaying, they're flying around in circles and they're running out of fuel, or at least Sweeney thought. And because they were running out of fuel, there became a very real possibility that they were going to have to ditch the bomb in the Pacific Ocean and possibly ditch their aircraft and abort the mission. They came very close to doing that. And luckily, they caught up with Hopkins, or Hopkins caught up with them and the mission proceeded. But for decades afterwards, Sweeney blamed Hopkins for what happened. But in fact, Tibbets and LeMay both blamed Sweeney for his loss of command control at the time. That just led to a lot of bitterness that proceeded well into the 1970s and the 80s on Sweeney's part. So there was that ego battle. There was another ego battle going on between General LeMay and General Loris Norstad. They had been in competition for years, and Norstad had it out for Colonel Tibbets, and was constantly kind of meddling in this atomic mission to try to seize control of the mission from Tibbets. And LeMay had to kind of stand in the way and make sure that Tibbets was given the control he needed to carry out the mission. And so you have those egos all at play, all at once, adding on to the pressure that Tibbets faced at the time. There was an attempt by some generals at the Pentagon to interfere, and they called Tibbets back to Washington right before the mission was to start, and so Hopkins and another colonel who was a commander on the mission were called off to have a talk with LeMay on a neighboring island, and they were told, if Tibbets doesn't make it back because of potential, Japanese attack or whatever, you two have to be ready to carry out this mission. And they came back and told Sweeney about this, and Sweeney hit the roof, just absolutely hit the roof, and thought it was a palace coup that they were trying to take over. So those were the egos involved in this. What also needs to be noted in all of this is the issue of fuel. These were B-29 bombers, and the development of the B-29, it's very little is known about this, but it cost $1 billion in 1940s dollars to develop the atomic bomb. It cost $2 billion to develop the B-29. It was just as cherished by Curtis LeMay and the Army Air Forces as was the bomb itself. And 3 U.S. planes ran out of fuel over China or over Russia during the war, and had to land on Russian territory. And because of their inability to get enough fuel, they effectively handed over America's most top secret aircraft to the Soviets, and that stuck in LeMay's craw. But then, when the fuel problem arose again on the Nagasaki mission, LeMay became absolutely convinced that they had to find a way to refuel planes in flight. And so he ordered the development of something called the KB-29 fuel tank. And it was a tank that was shaped to fit into the expanded bomb bay opening for a Fatman bomb. In other words, it was a tank that would be just slightly bigger than a Fatman bomb that would fit up in that same area, and you could fill it up with gasoline, with fuel, and then conduct an aerial refueling operation to make sure you never had that problem again. And LeMay later demonstrated this ability by having a B-29 fly all the way around the world, and that was thanks to the KB-29. So I'll let you follow up with a question there if you choose to.
Yeah, I mean, these are all the circumstances leading up to the flight that we've kind of been circling around. So let's talk about the possible reason for the Globemaster mission to the UK. Talk about the plane itself, about its cargo, what that cargo may or may not have been, and the identity of the passengers. I mean, there's questions about what happened prior to the flight that you were asking, what happened during the flight, and what happened after the flight went down. What was this mission about?
So the United States and Britain were having absolutely top secret negotiations. They both countries, as well as several other countries in Europe, were deathly afraid that the Soviets were getting ready to invade. They were going to sweep across the continent and create a giant Soviet state. At the same time, the Korean War broke out, and there were deep concerns among the Air Force Command that this was a feint by the Soviets, that Korea was not the real objective. What they were trying to do was draw U.S. forces over to Asia in order to open the way for them to attack Europe. So the American administration was desperate to convince the British to host the deployment of atomic weaponry in preparation for whatever might come. If the Soviets decided to invade Europe, it was going to happen too quickly for the Allied forces to muster a counterforce on the ground to stop them. They knew that the Soviets were going to succeed if they decided with those millions of troops to sweep across Europe. So what they needed was a ready atomic attack force to go after them and at least stall that movement. And they even had their doubts that an atomic attack would stop them, but they knew they had to do something. It wasn't the kind of thing where they could just load up an atomic bomb on one or more B-29s in the United States and fly them over. That crucial amount of time it was going to take to move the bombs into place, load them on a plane, and get those planes in the air, fly them across the Atlantic, and then launch an attack. It was going to be too late. The Soviets were already going to be where they needed to be in Europe, and they were going to be knocking at the door of Britain at that point. And so they knew that they needed those bombs to be in place in Britain, ready to go. And so they talked to the British government about it. This was the government of Clement Attlee, who succeeded Winston Churchill. And Attlee was very afraid of this becoming public, because if it became public, the British population was going to hit the roof. The images of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not play well in Europe, and so he was concerned that the British people were going to object strongly to the presence of atomic weapons on their soil. So it all had to be done in secret, and so they began secret efforts to deploy the components of these weapons over to Britain. And they couldn't do it in the open because, a Fatman bomb, there's nothing like it. Once you see it, you don't forget it, and it's very hard to hide a Fatman bomb. If you fly it over in a plane, you have to offload it off of that plane, and there are going to be people around who are going to see what you're doing. So it would have been very hard to keep that secret. They did manage to get some dummy Fatman bombs over there, and they were disguised under the code name M107. And if you try to go through the documents from the time, it is extremely difficult to find any reference either to a Fatman or an M107. I had to pour through thousands of pages of documents to come up with the references that I needed to an M107, and I found out about it when I came across something called Project Evening Star. And that in March of 1951, the Strategic Air Command began these maneuvers over Britain, over the Mediterranean, and over Europe, in which they had to coordinate three different sets of flights. One were B-29s that were loaded with M107s. The other was KB-29 tankers, which would be deployed to rendezvous in midair with the B-29s and refuel them. And then there were other planes whose job was to use electronic countermeasures as well as physical countermeasures to deter any Soviet attack from the air. So it was intricate for these three groups of planes to meet up in the air, and so they needed to practice it a lot, because this was exactly the scenario that was going to be used. It was going to take place if they did launch an actual attack. So they needed to know what were the atmospheric conditions over Europe. They needed to know, what they might encounter on the ground, what they might encounter on the air. And the whole time they were doing this Operation Evening Star, they were aware that the Soviets could very well try to intervene as they were conducting their mission, their practice mission. And so all of these documents refer to, efforts that the pilots should undertake should they be detected, should they be confronted by enemy aircraft. And so it was very real. For all these images that we have of America being at peace at the time, they were fully aware that confrontation with the Soviets had occurred and could very well occur again over Europe and the Mediterranean. So Operation Evening Star is in progress. This Globemaster 49244 is at Roswell, Walker Air Force Base in Roswell, New Mexico. They loaded up two KB-29 tanks on board the plane, and loaded up, there were 10 crew members, and I think they loaded up another close to 40, maybe 30 something members of the Strategic Air Command. And then they flew to Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, where Paul Cullen boarded with another entourage, making 53 in total. And then they flew up to Gander and then across toward their destination in Britain. They made it just about 700 miles off the coast of Ireland when the plane took a sharp right turn, a sharp southward turn, and went 300 miles almost due south and pitched in the Atlantic. One thing I should note, the KB-29s that were on board only weighed about 6,000 pounds. There was an additional 135,000 pounds of other items on board. And that weight was crucial because that was the same weight as a Fatman atomic bomb. Mm-hmm. So, and there was substantial evidence. I've seen the manifests of the plane, and it varies widely depending on which manifest you read. But we have come across lots of documents that the manifests aboard various Globemaster flights going out of Roswell at the time as having been fudged. They were they were fictitious. There were planes that would take off with 100,000 pounds of cargo. They would fly for 20,000 miles and then remarkably return right to Roswell. Mm-hmm. The manifests would list their cargo as uniforms or something like that, something innocuous. They were acts of fiction. So anyway, the plane makes it almost across the Atlantic. takes this strange turn, and before it does, it ceases all radio communication. So there was no indication of any stress, any strange happening aboard the plane, but it takes this hard turn and goes south, slowly descending, and apparently makes a fairly smooth ditched landing on the Atlantic, and the plane, the investigators believed, landed intact. I'm sure it was a rough landing. You don't just land a C-124 anywhere without it bouncing around a lot. Certainly not on water. But it landed intact, and there were survivors. They were spotted by a reconnaissance plane the next day, but the survivors disappeared, the plane disappeared, and the cargo on board disappeared. And that was kind of the impetus for the entire book, is what happened to them.
There were a number of investigations, I understand. What did they come up with anything that was concrete?
No, concrete. No. I mean, there was general agreement from the very few pieces of charred wood from the flooring of the Globemaster that there was a fire, but that the fire didn't start until the plane had already hit the water, and that's because of the way the ability of the fire to penetrate the wood. They did tests on that wood to see if you burn it for this amount of time, how far will the flames go, how much will they penetrate in charring the wood, and the lack of charring led them to believe that the plane was not on fire until it hit the water. So they ruled out an explosion or fire on board as having prompted this crisis that made the plane turn and go south. There was a top secret investigation into sabotage that also was inconclusive, but they did absolutely believe that there was a possibility of sabotage. And in fact, Curtis LeMay had warned ahead of this flight that there was an increased concern about sabotage, that Soviet or enemy agents might try to sabotage Strategic Air Command missions. And so he had very recently ordered all kinds of upgrades in security measures at all Strategic Air Command bases, and as well as his personal security, because they believed that the Russians were up to something. So there was that, and they ruled out a mechanical problem as the cause of the ditching. They couldn't explain why there was no communication of any kind on the aircraft with any weather ships that were in the area. They were within radio range of both the UK and Ireland, as well as weather ships in the Atlantic, so they could have radioed. So there was speculation that maybe the plane threw a propeller, and that the propeller had cut through the fuselage right where the communications cables and control cables intersected, because they were, in fact, in line with the propellers. So it could conceivably have sliced through all of that and rendered the plane inoperable and rendered them unable to communicate that they had a problem. There's only one problem with that theory. First of all, they had a number of life rafts on board that were equipped with a radio, a hand winding radio that they could have used in an emergency to communicate an SOS to surrounding vessels to say they were in trouble. They didn't do that, and they had plenty of time to do it. And any pilot or crew member aboard that plane, assuming there wasn't just panic among everybody, which would be unlikely, somebody would have thought to use those, but they didn't. Then there's the question of, okay, if the propeller sliced through the controls, then how did the plane manage to fly almost directly due south and ditch? You can't, if a plane has no controls, you can't control where it goes, and you certainly can't control its ability to land smoothly on water. So that was ruled out. So they didn't know what caused it. It was a very confusing thing. And so I theorized in the book, I looked at Soviet capabilities at the time and what they had done in previous encounters with U.S. reconnaissance planes over Lithuania. And in fact, the Soviets were highly capable of intercepting U.S. planes with MiG fighters and forcing them down, which they did off the coast of Lithuania, and it led to the death or capture of a reconnaissance crew on board. Had the Soviets been able to intercept this plane, had they gotten information ahead of time, knowing what this mission was about, the MiGs could have intercepted, forced it off course, and forced it to smoothly ditch. And so in 2016, the United States government, believing the same thing, confronted the Russian government about this and asked them directly. We have reason to believe that there were Soviet ships and submarines, military ships and submarines, in the exact area where this plane went down. And they asked them, do you have any information on that? The Soviets basically said, we'll get back to you. And then they said, no, can't find anything. And that was that.
So there's no declassified records of orders explaining the mission that Cullen and the others were to undertake once they arrived in Britain. And in your epilogue, you state that even with all discussion about atomic deployments and actual movements of M107s to Britain, there's only been a strong hint that something of an atomic nature was aboard the Globemaster, but no document has confirmed that. Do you think there's any existing classified documents that could still provide proof? And if so, would they ever be declassified?
Well, I have strong reason to believe there are classified documents because I've asked for them. I zeroed in on several of them, and I asked directly for them. And I was both at the Library of Congress in one case and at requesting the documents from the National Archives in another case. And I couldn't get an answer from anyone. I kept saying, why is it? This is 75 years that these documents have been classified. Why can the American people not see these documents after all this time? And I finally got an archivist to call me up, and she said, I can't answer your question directly, but I can read you the rules by which documents might remain classified. And then the specific rule that she quoted me was one that said, if there is the possibility of an atomic or a nuclear weapon having been lost and never recovered, the documents that might give an indication of where that weapon is located may remain classified until the weapon is located. And he said, got it? I said, I got it.
Yeah, that's a pretty good hint, I'd say.
Yeah. So there's a strong possibility that somewhere under thousands of feet of water in the North Atlantic, there's a broken arrow.
Well, another important aspect of your book is the chapter that you call Learning How to Lie. And in it there you examine, the most famous alien/UFO incident in history, the Roswell incident. It's a short chapter, but in it you lay out the premise for how the U.S. military and the U.S. government's attempt at secrecy had been a catalyst not only for the growth of conspiracy theories, but for the government's almost desperate attempts to keep global status secret. So tie in those two concepts for us.
So the reason I started to look into the Roswell incident only because I knew that Lieutenant Colonel Hopkins, who was aboard the plane with Cullen when it went down, that Lieutenant Colonel Hopkins had been among the commanders at Roswell when this event happened, when the Roswell incident happened, and he got to see the items that were recovered. And he made that clear to his family. And the reason I know this is Colonel Hopkins was my wife's grandfather, and it was his disappearance that got me interested in this, because when we got married, my father-in-law would talk about this unexplained disappearance of the plane that his father was on, and they thought it was an explosion because that's what the government told them. And so he's grown up, or gotten old, believing one thing and then discovering that it was all a lie. And so I started looking back at kind of the history and realizing, throughout World War II, the U.S. government and the military were very clear. If they couldn't talk about something, they wouldn't tell you about it. It was secret. But if it was a bad thing that happened, they would admit it was a bad thing. If a U.S. warship was attacked and sunk, they would report it. They would acknowledge it. They wouldn't lie about it. They'd just say what happened, and that was that. But when the Cold War started, this concern about secrecy kind of went to a new dimension, and they began practicing the art of the half-truth. You don't tell all the truth. You give just kind of enough information to answer the question, but not the full information about what's going on. And then later this morphed into just outright lies. So the Roswell incident, at the time, the United States was experimenting with very high altitude balloons that they had planned to fly over the Soviet Union with this ability to detect radiation, high levels of radiation, and so what they needed to know was, did the Soviets possess a nuclear bomb? And if they did, the Americans needed to know about it as soon as it happened. And so these balloon flights were to test this equipment that would detect radiation. And so they were doing practice flights over New Mexico as well as over Nevada. And one of these very shiny Mylar balloons landed in a farmer's field, and it had all this equipment on board. And so the farmer reported it, and the officials at Roswell scrambled, got out to the scene and collected the material and brought it to the base. And only a very few people at Roswell were briefed on what these balloon flights were all about. And so there was a lower level official who got permission to tell United Press International that, yep, it's an alien flight, that we finally, we've confirmed it. And the U.S. Air Force later had to walk back the story and say, no, it wasn't. It was just a weather balloon. But it wasn't just a weather balloon. It was a balloon that was designed for top secret activity. So that's the issue about the lie. And then I carry that forward because that was the point when the United States learned that maybe it couldn't trust its own people with the truth, and the American people learned that they couldn't necessarily trust the U.S. government to tell them the truth.
So these are all the circumstances on a kind of a macro level, world level. But, there's a further story, a people story, the two Mrs. Paul T. Cullens. the consequences of the actions of their husband. Tell us what happened to those two women after Cullen disappeared on that flight.
So the two women, they knew of each other. And I went to where Reva Hurwitz's archives were kept in Wyoming at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and spent a very long time, going through her personal letters home about this colonel that she met during Operation Crossroads, and then there's this letter from Reva Hurwitz's brother to Paul Cullen, talking about this unfortunate situation, and it's very clear from the letter that the unfortunate situation that he's talking about is Cullen telling Reva Hurwitz's family, I've got this divorce situation that I've got to clear up. And because the family was kind of celebrating that they're married, but it was murky. And I talked to the children of that brother who are still living in the Wyoming and Colorado area, and they all said that their father and their uncle, Reva's other brother, were highly suspicious of Cullen. They just didn't trust him, and so that was warning number one. The fact that he had chosen to take Reva to Mexico to get married instead of just getting married in the United States was warning number two, that something wasn't quite right. And then Ruth Cullen, the wife of 16 years, said in an interview with the New York Daily News in late 1951 that she had been going through her husband's clothes before she sent them off to the cleaner to make sure he didn't leave anything in the pockets, and she pulled out a letter that Reva had written to Paul Cullen. And she confronted him about the letter, and he goes, "Oh, she's just that little Red Cross girl. It means nothing. It means nothing." Warning sign number 3. So it goes on and on. The two women were aware of each other, and neither one was backing down. And Ruth Cullen said that at one point they met up in New York during a massive snowstorm. And Ruth said she felt a little bit sorry for Reva, and so they talked through the night. And I think Ruth even let Reva stay in her hotel room, but they talked things out, and Ruth just basically told her, you got to go get your own husband. He's mine. And Reva said, "Well, I'm in love with him." And I don't know how they ended it. The story didn't really explain it, but Paul T. Cullen told both of them, "You're going to be moving to the United Kingdom in the not too distant future. I'm being deployed over there as commander of the Strategic Air Command, and so get ready." And so both women were fully aware of the mission and making preparations for a move over to Britain. I don't know how he planned to deal with that if both of them showed up there. So the plane goes down. Paul Cullen disappears. Takes months, but eventually a death certificate is issued. And so Reva then begins trying to collect on death benefits. She files a claim to an insurance policy and gets paid. The insurance company recognized her as the spouse, and so she collected on that death benefit. And then they started trying to collect from the U.S. government, and that's when Ruth Cullen began to ask questions. And she contacted an attorney she knew down in Tampa, who also had served with Elliott Roosevelt and Paul Cullen in North Africa. And that attorney started digging into things and then realized, oh my God, he was married to two women at the same time. So that attorney filed a lawsuit in Tampa, claiming that Ruth Cullen was the sole successor and the sole beneficiary. And that led to a lengthy lawsuit in Tampa, as well as another lawsuit against Riva by the insurance company to recover the death benefits, the insurance company payout, and a federal trial concluded that she was not, in fact, the wife and had no claim to that insurance policy. And the judge down in Florida never got to, well, I don't know what he ruled because there is zero record of it, of any ruling. Ruth got sick and had to postpone, they had to postpone the trial. And then there's no reporting of it. Florida court records have no record of what happened after that. Newspapers didn't report on it, so I couldn't verify. I even called up the law firm of the judge to see if they had anything in their archives about it. They said they just couldn't come up with anything. So I have no idea, but the judge did conclude the final hearing before he postponed it and saying, this man has a lot of questions to answer for. I would really like to talk to him.
The very, very real consequences of Paul T. Cullen.
Yes, and I would just interject. During the trial, one of Paul Cullen's former bosses, a colonel who had been his boss, said that he directly confronted Paul Cullen about his relationships and told him, "You have got to clean up this mess." And that's what prompted the judge to say, well, he's got some questions to answer. I really would like to talk to him.
So finally, Tod, do you think that this is a story that could only have happened in post-World War II? Since at that time, there really wasn't a huge buildup of nuclear weapon arsenals for the leading world nations, or are we still living in that nuclear chess match?
It was a unique period. Let's put it that way. It was a period when technology had yet to catch up with, the technology at the time was rudimentary. I mean, radar itself was in its very infant stages. There's no such thing as cell phones. No satellites were flying through the sky. You couldn't do mapping and all this other stuff to locate, where this missing plane had gone down. So it was a unique circumstance in the sense of people were able to get away with stuff because there just wasn't this electronic means to track them down and find out what crazy stuff they were up to. So it was very hard to detect spies like Klaus Fuchs, to know what they were sending over to the Soviet Union about the Manhattan Project. Very difficult to catch Kim Philby and the other Cambridge Five, who were also spying on the United States disguised as British diplomats. And it was very difficult to detect that Paul Cullen himself was up to no good with two separate wives. Mm-hmm. And so that was unique. As the world became more technologically sophisticated, the means to get away with this stuff slowly began to disappear. It became much more difficult. It's also the means of delivering atomic weaponry. The B-29 was supplanted by much more sophisticated aircraft, and then after that, missiles were developed, and all of a sudden there wasn't a need for the Air Force to deploy planes loaded with atomic weaponry, because missiles could do it much more efficiently and certainly much faster. So there wouldn't be a need to sneak a plane into or sneak a plane loaded with an atomic weapon into another country, at least not on the American side. A country like Iran might want to do it, but no. From the American side, that was a unique moment in history where all of these crazy circumstances seem to have come together.
And, there's even more circumstances in the book. There's other aspects that we haven't been able to cover. Your readers will discover that. But this has been so intriguing and really thought-provoking to hear about this dangerous period of history. And we thank you for providing this insight.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation tremendously.
And I thank all of you for tuning in. For online information about this and other podcast topics, log on to outrageoushistory.com. For Outrageous History, I'm Ernest Granson.
Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.